Well, Fanalysis is shifting to football season, and here to break down the best draft strategy is one of the foremost experts in fantasy football, the author of the Fantasy Football Black Book, Joe Pisapia, joining us once again. Joe, good to have you in studio again, man.
It's a pleasure to be back yet again.
Your information is always top of the line. It's really difficult for me to share it with everybody else.
I almost on TV, Steve. You know that, right?
I know. But I want to keep the information for myself. But to do this service for the rest of the community, we are going to allow you to reveal more information. And what I think is most important about the Fantasy Black Book is that you have this system. It's called relative position value. It's kind of like war in baseball, where you're mixing and matching both our players from different categories. How do you see that as, I guess, the most efficient way to try to find value in players?
Well, that's a really good way of putting it. And I think that the difference is nowadays what you're seeing in terms of fantasy football coverage, everyone's got their rankings and everyone's got their lists, but really that's not a strategy. So what RPV, or relative position value, does is it allows you to understand not just where the guys are ranking, but how much better one player is than another by comparing them to each other. And then what you have is a beautiful relative position value, and then you understand from that value how to address certain positions and certain ADP, and that's how you create a strategy, not just a list.
And I think that's a great point, because there's such a big drop-off at running backs at the top of the list. It makes you wonder if you can actually even contend in a league if you don't go with an elite running back early on.
Well, I think you can contend in a league, especially in a full-point PPR, because there are running backs like Tariq Cohen, there are running backs like James White, guys like that. You can make up that ground a little later on.
But you've got to hit on those guys.
You do? Well, yes and no, because you know what those roles are, and you're in a unique position this year where there's guys like David Montgomery, like Josh Jacobs, who are new to the league that I think can contribute. You saw guys like last year, Aaron Jones, Marlon Mack, all have really good second half. So there are guys that emerge and come out of that and end up as good RB2 type guys. But yeah, sure, it's great to have one of those RB1s. However, wide receiver ones are still in full-point PPR, guys that you want to build rosters around.
When we look at the first round, I see top 7 picks are all running backs. Do you see any scenario where if you had the #1 pick that you would go with a receiver?
I wouldn't, but I think you can make the case for a guy like DeAndre Hopkins because he is so good at what he does and so consistent. See, the difference between the running backs and the wide receivers is the consistency in terms of the touches, in terms of the targets, in terms of their productivity. Whereas with the running backs, there's always that higher injury quotient as well. And all 4 of the guys now at the top all have a little bit of question. So as we're getting closer to the season, there's a little bit of doubt creeping in.
Let me tell you, man, the worst thing that can happen to your team is your first-round pick getting injured. That you want security out of that first round, no matter who that is, because that guy should be able to get you points. But right now, when we look at some of these running backs, we're seeing holdouts, we're seeing injury concerns with guys like Zeke and Gordon and Gurley and the other Gordon. I mean, how do you value what those guys can do and what they won't do?
Well, look. First, you got to take him individually, because Ezekiel Elliott, I think, is still going to sign. He's still got 2 years left on the deal, so I know everyone is panicked. Why? Because of what Le'Veon Bell did last year, which is hold out the whole season. Melvin Gordon's a little bit trickier. That's a guy that I'm a little bit more concerned that holdout can actually last into the season, and that's something to be very concerned about. And then, of course, you got Todd Gurley, who people are a little worried about that knee. I am less worried about it. He had a clean offseason, very healthy in the preseason. They've backed off of him. They have a plan for how to manage him better this year during the season. So to me, I think it's all Todd Gurley again, as I sit here every year and say, for a 3rd straight year, all Todd Gurley once again.
Which is unbelievable, because you've predicted correctly a good or a bad season out of Todd Gurley. He should be watching you to figure out whether or not he's going to have a good season.
Well, you humble me, Steve. You humble me. But I think once again, you go back to that Todd Gurley because the upside is what? The best running back on the planet, and that's what you want on your roster.
Well, I feel like we kind of make snap judgments sometimes about these players because recency bias. Last time we saw Todd Gurley, C.J. Anderson was the one getting all the carries in the Super Bowl. We've been burned by players that get injured before, and that's what we want to try to stay away from. That's why Gurley scares a lot of people.
And that's fine, but scared doesn't always win. And that's the thing. You've got to take advantage of when you're getting a discount. And it's one thing to say, well, do I want to take him in the top 5 overall? Maybe you don't. But if you scale back Todd Gurley's production to, say, I don't know, 10 to 15% less than last year, he's still a top 5 running back. So if you're getting a discount at the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd round on him, I would still take that plunge because the upside is just so damn high.
Okay, so if he falls to you, don't pass on him, but don't take him where you would have normally taken him in any other year. But, okay, So more leagues are clearly going to this 3 wide receiver and a flex position, which means we could need 4 wide receivers or 3 running backs, and it really puts the importance on grabbing strong running backs and strong wide receivers in the first 5 or 6 rounds. Do you want to be the anomaly that goes out there and grabs a tight end or a quarterback early, or do you want to be the guy that goes for, I guess, these second-tier tight ends and quarterbacks?
Well, this is where relative position value in the Black Book really comes into play, because the answer to that question is based off of the value and where you can create an advantage. So if you're looking to get one of the big-time tight ends and you can do that, that's an advantage on your league. And then that advantage kind of drops off after you get to that number 4 O.J. Howard spot, and there's no more advantage, so why reach? You also can look at that wide receiver 2 class, and there's not a whole lot of difference between the Tyler Boyds, the Calvin Ridleys, those kind of guys who are very productive. But the stats are going to be very comparable at the end of the year. So why reach when you can continue to load up on RB or take a shot on one of the tight ends?
Well, that's it. Do you reach for those guys? Could you see yourself, if you have 12, if you're at 12, could you see yourself taking Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce?
In a single quarterback league, no, not even then. I think 3rd or 4th round is where you would even entertain discussing Mahomes. Personally, for me, I think it would have to be 4th or 5th. But I understand a lot of people still like the quarterback. To me, if you can take a Kelce and say Julio Jones, that's a very good start to the season.
What's the worst thing you see people do in drafts? You've probably seen some pretty bad stuff.
I have. I think what happens is sometimes the worst thing I see in drafts is when people try to elevate players just because they're the new toy. And I think that's something where you look at Kyler Murray this year, he's that guy this year. It's not that Murray doesn't have talent, but there's so many questions. The offensive line is a question. The new coach is a question. The fact that he's a smaller quarterback is a question. So when people want to elevate people just because they're new, that's not a good enough reason. Just because they want to be first to the table, it's better to be right than to be first.
Well, you know what? I think a lot of people put ego in front of their team destiny, more or less. So there's plenty of times in each one of these drafts that you can maybe change the trajectory of a draft. You can almost start a run on a position. Right. Do you have any tips or tricks that you might be able to play on owners that are just nervous and might be a little bit easier to handle?
We can find some things. I think that's easier to do in Superflex, because Superflex is the 2 quarterback format. It's a little easier there because if you're aggressive early on with the guys like Mahomes, like Watson, you can kind of push the needle. If one team doubles up on quarterback early on or 2 elite quarterbacks, all of a sudden that puts a little bit of pressure on everybody else because you want a 3rd quarterback on those rosters to cover those other 2's bye weeks. So to me, I think Superflex is where you have that ability to kind of dominate and push around how you want the runs to happen in a draft.
This is interesting, and I tell you what, we could talk for an hour about this, but we could also pick up his book. He's the author of the Fantasy Football Black Book, and you can get it on Amazon right now. And make sure you check out our next segment on sleepers. He is Joe Pisapia. I'm Steve Overmyer, and this is Fanalysis.